So before half term in Beetle Boy, we left Darkus and Uncle Max in the vaults of the Natural History Museum, and they've discovered that some of the species of beetle have gone missing from different specimen drawers, and Baxter, Darkus's rhinoceros beetle, has disappeared through a grate and has just reappeared dragging something behind him. We're about to find out what. Darkus licked round the widest part of his hand to make it slippery and pushed it through the mesh grate, reaching in until his upper arm stopped him from moving any further. He laid his hand flat on the floor. "Come on, Baxter," he whispered. "Get on my hand." The beetle slowly crawled backwards, gradually backing onto Darkus's palm. He had something gold hooked over his horn. Gently cupping his hand around the beetle, Darkus carefully pulled his arm back out of the grate and sat up cross-legged on the floor. He uncurled his fingers and cried out as he recognised the gold half-moon glasses hanging off Baxter's horn. "What's the matter, lad?" Darkus got to his feet, clutching the glasses in his right hand and hiding Baxter behind his back with his left. "I found Dad's glasses. There, behind the grate." What were they doing down there? Uncle Max wondered. He took the glasses from Darkus, studied them, and then looked at Margaret. "I don't know." Her bottom lip wobbled. "The police said they searched the grates. They didn't find anything." "The glasses were quite far in," Darkus said. "Well done, Darkus." Uncle Max winked at him. "You found a clue." He looked at Margaret. "Did Barty come down here often for work?" "No," she replied. "Actually, his being in this room was strange. He avoided anything to do with the beetles. I thought perhaps he was phobic, frightened of them." Uncle Max snorted. "Barty's not frightened of beetles." "I guess Bartholomew would have been wearing his glasses to look at samples." She sounded uncertain. "Perhaps they fell through the grate when... Oh dear." Her voice quivered and she began to cry. "Sorry." Darkus looked away, embarrassed by her sudden gush of emotion. Uncle Max patted Margaret's arm gently. There, Maggie, don't go upsetting yourself." Darkus stepped over the table and dropped Baxter into the jam jar. The beetle went in without protesting this time, but as Darkus screwed the lid on, he started to flick his elytra open, bashing them against the glass and hissing loudly as he'd done to Robbie. "What's the matter?" Darkus whispered, almost dropping the jar as it jerked out of his hands. But Baxter kept flailing about and hissing. "What's wrong with the insect?" Uncle Max asked over Margaret's shoulder. "I don't know." Darkus scratched his head. "He didn't seem to mind being in the jar earlier. Should I let him out?" "Darkus, you can't go letting live insects loose in here. What if Baxter damages the collection? Keep him in the jar." Darkus picked up the jar and hugged it to his chest, hoping Baxter would calm down, but now he was ramming the glass with his horn over and over again. Shh, it's all right." But the beetle kept on headbutting the glass, stopping only to hiss. Darkus looked in the direction in which Baxter's horn was pointing and found he was looking at the door. Something moving above the door caught his eye. It was a lemon-yellow ladybird, the size of a 2-pence coin, speckled with black spots. Darkus pointed. "I thought you said live insects weren't allowed in here." Uncle Max and Margaret looked up. The ladybird paused and then took off, disappearing into the corridor. "That's strange," Margaret muttered. "I saw a big yellow ladybird in here on the day that Bartholomew disappeared. I'd forgotten it in all the excitement." Darkus looked at Uncle Max. Beetles seemed to be everywhere. Had that always been the case and he'd just never noticed, or did the yellow ladybird mean something? Uncle Max was staring at Baxter, who was now sitting quietly in his jar. He stroked his chin and looked down the corridor after the ladybird. "I think it might be time to leave," he said, his eyes flickering about the room as if he expected someone to jump out at them. "What? But don't we want to find out how Dad's glasses got into the grate?" Darkus asked. "We came to have a look around and I think we've done that. So let's thank Margaret for letting us see the room and head out into the museum. Maybe take a look at a few dinosaurs, yes?" Uncle Max grabbed Darkus's backpack and threw it at him. "You're going to have to put Baxter away, lad, and keep him hidden. Hop to it." Darkus lifted Baxter's jar into the bag. Something was going on that he'd missed. Uncle Max looked worried now, in fact, worse than worried, and he was ushering Margaret in the direction of the door. "Can I take one more look at the rhinoceros beetles?" Darkus asked, crossing the room to get his red book. "No, it's time to go," Uncle Max said firmly, looking him in the eye. "Right now." "OK," Darkus nodded, wondering if it was the yellow ladybird that had made his uncle so desperate to leave. "No one can enter these rooms without an appointment, right?" Uncle Max said to Margaret. She nodded. "Well, no one except the sponsor?" "That's what I was afraid of," Uncle Max muttered, handing Darkus the reading glasses. "You'd better keep tight hold of these. You found them, after all, and Bart is going to need them when he gets home." He heard Darkus through the door. "Shouldn't we tell the police about the glasses, Max?" Margaret asked as he pushed Darkus past her into the corridor. "I don't think so." Uncle Max shook his head and pulled a reassuring face. "If anything really useful crops up, I'll let them know." "Oh, OK." Margaret closed the vault door, and took her keys and to lock it. "Well, it was very kind of you to let us see the room, but we must be getting on, Maggie." Uncle Max moved backwards down the hall. "Wait." Margaret took a folder from her shoulder bag. "I don't know if this will help, but these are the papers Barty had in the vault with him. The police scanned them and returned them to me, assuming they were museum business. The top letter is addressed to the museum, but the rest of the notes are in Barty's handwriting, and I don't recognise the subject matter. Perhaps a personal project? I thought you should have them." "Thank you, Maggie." Uncle Max took the file and tucked it under his armpit. "That's very thoughtful." Darkus looked at the folder. It said Faber Project on it. At the back of his mind he knew he'd seen those words before, but he couldn't put his finger on where. "It really is lovely to see you, Maggie." Uncle Max covered Margaret's hand with his own. "Thank you for letting us into the vault. It means a lot to Darkus and to me." He paused. "Perhaps you'd like to have dinner some evening." Margaret flushed with pleasure and gave a little nod as she stared down at Uncle Max's hand on hers. "You'll let me know if you hear anything," she whispered. "Of course." Uncle Max kissed her hand. Darkus was unimpressed. "Onwards!" Uncle Max pointed, and Darkus followed his order, disappearing down the corridor before there was more kissing. Eddie let them out through the same door, and they stopped briefly to say goodbye. Then Uncle Max hurried Darkus past the dinosaur exhibition towards the exit. "What's the rush?" Darkus said. "Just a hunch, lad, but I'd rather not wait around to see if I'm right," Uncle Max replied, not explaining himself. Darkus rolled his eyes and tried to keep up. As they rushed through the hints hall, past the giant Diplodocus skeleton, and towards the open doors of the main entrance, there was a terrific screeching sound, and Darkus saw a stunning black car drive up the pedestrianised driveway. People dived out of the way, grabbing onto their children and pulling them to safety. Darkus cried out as Uncle Max suddenly dragged him backwards through the nearest doorway into what turned out to be a disabled toilet. "What are you doing?" he shouted, alarmed. "Shh!" Uncle Max calmly put his finger to his lips. He opened the door a sliver and peered through the gap into the entrance hall of the museum. Two sparkling black sticks appeared, and then a woman's head. Jet black hair, gold lips, and then her body came lurching into view, leaning on the sticks. She wore a white laboratory coat over a long black dress, and every jarring movement of her body screamed out how angry she was. "Where is he?" she shouted at the unfortunate young man behind the information desk. "Who?" he quivered. "The snivelling director of this rotting institution." She lifted a hand from its stick, which hung from a loop around her wrist, and smashed it down onto the counter. "He's let someone into my vault." "Ah, Madam Cutter," came a terrified voice, accompanied by the pattering of hurried footsteps. "To what do I owe this honour?" "Shut up," she barked. "Take me downstairs immediately. There's someone in my vault." "I can assure you, Madam Cutter, that cannot be true. No one can enter the Coleoptera vaults without an appointment. We do not permit the public to enter the collection rooms." "Don't tell me what's true and what isn't," she snarled. "Take me downstairs now." Of course, forgive me." A trembling bald man came into view, and Darkus saw it was Mr. Langley, Dad's boss and the director of the museum. He was sweating so much that Darkus could see it dripping off his nose. He looked at Uncle Max, who still had his finger pressed to his lips. "Follow me." Mr. Langley gestured. Madam Cutter stalked past him. Of course, you know the way. I'll follow you, shall I? Darkus pushed his eye to the crack in the door and saw a chauffeur, a short Chinese woman, following several paces behind Madam Cutter. Behind them stumbled Mr. Langley, tripping over his own feet. Who was that? Darkus asked. Uncle Max drew in a long breath. That is Lucretia Cutter, and she is bad news. The Cutter Coleoptera collection woman? The very one. So we were the ones in her vault? That was us, Uncle Max nodded. But how did she know we were in there? Darkus asked. I didn't see any cameras unless... How indeed, Uncle Max replied, poking his head out of the toilet door. When he was certain Lucretia Cutter had gone, he motioned for Darkus to follow him. Business as usual, he said, straightening his safari hat and giving his nephew a reassuring smile. They walked calmly out of the museum as if nothing had happened. As they passed Madame Cutter's car, Darkus couldn't help but stare at it. It was iridescent black, and where the light bounced off its body, it shimmered purple and green. It was a classic shape that looked like it had driven right out of one of his comics. The windows were tinted like cars in the movies. Darkus thought he saw the outline of a girl's face pressed against the back window. He stopped walking, but Uncle Max grabbed his arm, pulling him away. Keep moving, he whispered softly. Once they were round the corner and heading away from the museum, Uncle Max relaxed his pace. Are you okay? He nodded. Darkus nodded. I think so. Marvellous. Uncle Max pulled out his car keys. I must say it was a good job you spotted that yellow ladybird, or we would all be in all sorts of hot water right now. Darkus thought back to the yellow ladybird and Baxter's peculiar behaviour in the jam jar. It wasn't him that had spotted the ladybird, it was Baxter. The beetle had been trying to warn him. Why? Was the ladybird something to do with the Lucretia Cutter woman? It was also Baxter who'd found Dad's reading glasses. Darkus frowned as he played through everything that had happened in that room. It wouldn't have been odd if a dog had barked at the ladybird or found the glasses, but a beetle? He'd never heard of a beetle or any insect warning humans of danger. He wondered not for the first time about where Baxter had really come from before he'd ended up in the trouser leg of the ogre next door. Uncle Max opened the car, slid into the driving seat and reached over to open the passenger door for Darkus. As Darkus got in, he took off his backpack and unzipped it to check on Baxter. The beetle appeared to be sleeping. It was hard to tell when he was asleep because he didn't have eyelids, but his legs were very still and Darkus took that as a sign that he was resting. Uncle Max slotted the key into the ignition and the car started first time. He clapped his hands together in glee. Well, that couldn't have gone any better, really, could it? Starting the car, Darkus asked, or in the museum? All of it. We found Barty's glasses, drew the villain from her lair. Villain? We may not know how Barty disappeared, lad, or where he is, but you can bet your britches that that viper of a woman has something to do with it. He waggled his eyebrows. And, to top it off, I've got a dinner date with the lovely Maggie.